My wife wanted to get half of everything I owned, even though she herself slept with her ex, so I disappeared without a trace. I was sure that this day couldn't get any worse, but I was wrong. The entire week at work was terrible, and to top it all off, my boss, the president of the company, called me into his office to reprimand me for a mistake that someone else had made. When I got home, I discovered that my sister-in-law's car had blocked the driveway, preventing me from parking in front of my house. A teenager from the neighborhood and his friends had taken over the entire street with their cars, forcing me to park 3 houses away from mine. Entering the house, I wondered why I was even returning. My relationship with my wife Suzanne's sister had always been strained from the first day we met. I couldn't understand why she didn't like me from the start. Moreover, I had little hope for closeness with my wife Janice, since we weren't close for almost a month. Despite all my attempts, approaching the driveway, I noticed an empty gas tank by the roadside and dragged it through the side gates to the back door of the house. Entering the kitchen, I heard music and my wife and her sister chatting in the living room. Taking a beer from the fridge, I took a sip and headed to the living room. However, the phrase I heard at the door made me freeze in place. "God, she slapped me 3 times today," said not my sister-in-law, but my beloved wife. "Since Brandon returned last month, I just can't get enough of him," my wife confessed. Janice knew Brandon as her ex-boyfriend who once left her and left town. Her sister asked, "And what are you going to do now?" Janice replied, "Brandon wants me to move in with him, so I'm going to hire a lawyer and file for divorce. According to our state laws, I'll get half of everything." I heard more than enough, frozen. "Sev, take the wheel." I finally understood why I was being denied closeness. My wife was cheating with another man, and now she wanted half of everything. The worst part was that she was actually right about the laws. Janice and I had been married only 3 years ago. She quit her job right after the wedding, stayed home, and did absolutely nothing. I hired a maid who came 3 times a week for cleaning and laundry, and only on those days did my wife cook dinner. On other days, I cooked or we ordered takeout. I know what you might be thinking, but love blinded me. She made me happy thanks to great intimacy, at least until last month. My mother died when I was 13, and it was a devastating loss for both me and my father. Dad struggled to raise me right, and we became very close. Losing my father to a drunk driver when I was 23 was another heavy blow. It happened just a year before I met Janice. Inheriting almost $2.2 million from my father, I wisely invested the money with the help of a reliable broker. Despite Janice's attempts to spend every dollar I earned, I had several $100,000 in savings that I didn't even touch. The inheritance continued to grow even in the current economic conditions. I had enough money to live comfortably, and didn't need to spend it. My love for Janice made us give up the prenuptial agreement, a stupid mistake many make, naively thinking their marriage will last forever. This oversight meant she could get almost $1 million just for the privilege of sleeping with someone. The state seemed eager to support this legalized form of exploitation. She mentioned her intention to hire a lawyer, indicating that she wasn't ready to file the documents yet. I understood that I had little time to act. I sat in the car, devising a plan, and watched in the rearview mirror until I saw my sister-in-law's car drive away from the driveway and disappear from sight. I started the car, turned around, and parked near the house. Entering the house, I didn't find Janice, so I headed to the kitchen for another beer. Opening a bottle and taking a long sip, I pondered my next steps, knowing I couldn't take any action until Monday. On Saturday, I worked in the yard, played golf with friends on Saturday, and on Sunday. On Monday, I called my broker, who managed my portfolio, and told him to liquidate everything. My executive position allowed me to quickly cash out my pension fund despite the penalties. By Thursday, I was ready for the decisive step. Returning home to my supposedly loving wife, I informed her of the emergency situation and explained that I would have to fly out for a week on company business. I packed 2 suitcases. I didn't need anything else. When we moved into this house, I stored all important things because none of these items matched my wife's tastes. Therefore, besides personal belongings, I didn't need anything else. The setup was chosen exclusively by her, and honestly, I didn't care about it. The only advantage was that we were renting this house, and I didn't have financial investments in it. Recently, I sold my apartment, and we were in the process of looking for the perfect house to buy. When I say perfect, I mean one that would meet Janice's standards, but so far, none of the houses we viewed have pleased her. On Friday morning, I kissed my wife on the cheek for the last time and left the house with suitcases, loading them into my Lexus. My first stop was the house of an old friend, Jake, whom I trusted unconditionally. He was overwhelmed by the Lexus in exchange for his old car, entrusting him with my situation. An hour later, I was already driving west. I doubted anyone could trace me with that car, and Jake promised to keep my Lexus hidden in his garage for a while. Over the next few days, I paid for everything in cash, canceled all our credit cards to leave no trace. Most of my money was securely hidden in an offshore account. Thanks to my broker, I had a system set up to transfer funds as needed. In the car, I had enough cash to last a long time. The hardest part was the nights alone in a cheap motel. During the last week, I was too busy executing my plan to think about what had happened to me. Personally, I love Janice. I wouldn't have married her if it weren't for that. If it were otherwise, I'd be going through different scenarios in my head. What if? But in the end, I concluded that I couldn't have acted otherwise even if I knew her ex-boyfriend had returned. I probably couldn't have separated them. I came to 2 conclusions. She probably never truly loved me, and it was my fault for being stupid enough to marry her. On the 5th day away from home, I found myself in a small diner in some town in Montana. I was pondering what my loving wife was up to by this time. She must have already realized that all the credit cards were blocked and the bank account was empty. My thoughts were interrupted by an elderly couple at the neighboring table having a quiet conversation. I unintentionally overheard a man, who looked to be in his 60s, telling his red-haired wife that they needed an extra pair of hands on the farm. Unfortunately, they couldn't afford to hire anyone until their calves were ready for sale. Even then, finding someone willing to work for a small wage would be a big problem. After finishing the last bite of his dinner, I stood up and approached their table, apologized for eavesdropping, and said that I might be able to help. The elderly man looked me over carefully, assessing me from head to toe. "I don't see how you can help us. If you heard our conversation, you know I can't pay you. What if? I just need a place to stay in exchange for work," I suggested. His eyes narrowed. "Hold on a minute, I'll talk to this guy outside," he said to his wife, getting up from his chair. He gestured for me to follow him to the parking lot where our conversation would remain confidential. He turned to me, his face showing he was about my height, about 180 centimeters, with broad shoulders and no hint of excess weight. His once dark hair was mostly gray, and his face was covered in deep wrinkles left by years of hard outdoor labor. "Who are you anyway? You're from Wilson?" he asked suspiciously. I raised my hands in a conciliatory gesture and said, "Take it easy, buddy. I don't know any Wilson. 4 days ago, I was living in Texas, and this morning I arrived here, thinking maybe we could help each other." He replied, "If that's true, why would you help us? I can't pay you. What's in it for you? If you're on the run from the law, we don't need that kind of trouble. Maybe I am running, as you said, but not for the reason you think," I responded. I then told him my story about the unfaithful wife who wanted to strip me to the bone, and that I just needed somewhere to wait out. I didn't rob or kill anyone. I'm just trying to keep what rightfully belongs to me. If you have a place I could stay, I'd repay you with my labor. I'll support myself. And if you find me useless, just say so, and I'll leave. No hard feelings. He studied my face for a long time and then said, "Well, if you're telling the truth, I'd be a fool not to give you a chance. But I warn you, Wilson's men tried to force me to sell them land until they did something illegal, which I wouldn't be surprised if they did. Maybe you should get involved. Do I have ranch experience?" I honestly admitted that I had spent a few summer seasons on my uncle's farm in Texas, but didn't consider myself experienced. We shook hands. He offered to call him Bill, and I introduced myself in return. We returned to the diner where Colin was waiting for us. Bill addressed her. "Colin, this is Carson. He'll be working for us." She stood up, extended her hand, and I shook it. She warmly greeted me. "Nice to meet you, Carson." Her voice was clear and melodic with a faint Irish accent, just like her husband's. She was toned and slender. "Nice to meet you too, ma'am," she replied. "Our last name is Backman, but just call me Colin." Formalities aren't much appreciated around here. I immediately liked this friendly woman. Bill suggested we head to the ranch before leaving. He stopped by the local store, and we both got out of the cars. "You should buy clothes suitable for ranch work," he said as we entered the store. He received a warm greeting from the owner. Bill was clearly a regular customer. I bought myself a jacket and a pair of cowboy boots to start. It was enough to drive from the store to the main gates of the ranch, about a 20-minute drive to the house standing on a hill, another kilometer away. The two-story house looked well-maintained and recently painted. Behind it were a barn and several utility buildings. In the pickup truck bed were bags of groceries. They were clearly making their weekly trip to town for supplies. I parked behind them, grabbed a few bags, and followed the Backman couple into the kitchen. After unloading the truck, Bill said, "Drive to the back of the house," where he showed me a small shed meant for my accommodation. Entering the shed, there was one spacious room with a bed against the wall, a table with 2 chairs, a stove, a wood-burning stove in the corner, and a small bathroom with a shower. It wasn't luxurious housing, but it was clean and quite livable. For now, it was enough to hide from Janice. When I stepped outside, Bill was already sitting in his pickup truck and offered me a ride. He gave me a tour of the ranch, which covered almost 2,400 acres. Most of the land was used as pasture, and part was allocated for growing winter feed. The back part of the ranch was hilly and forested, extending into the mountains where a stream meandered through. Getting there was only possible on horseback. Bill mentioned that he used to have 3 permanent workers, but tough times forced him to reduce the staff, and now only Sam remained. He worked on the ranch for nearly 30 years, hiring temporary workers during the season when animals were selected for sale. After the tour, Bill drove me to the small shed. "By the way, I noticed you have a laptop. I have satellite internet here at the main house. We usually eat at 6, he said before leaving. Less than half an hour later, I unpacked my things and managed to turn on the laptop. As Bill said, I was able to connect to the wireless internet via the satellite network and quickly check my email. Among the messages was one from Jake, informing me that Janice had reported my disappearance to the police and the cops had started an investigation. This made me think Jake was the only one I had told about my departure, and even he didn't know where I was heading. Within 5 minutes, I went to the main house and knocked on the door. Bill shouted for me to come in. Entering, I saw Colin preparing dinner while Bill stood aside talking to a man who was probably Sam. Bill beckoned me with his hand. "Sam is Carson, the new worker I told you about. At least for today. Let's see how he feels after tomorrow's workday," he said with a broad smile. Sam warmly smiled at me and extended his hand. He was a large man, at least 190 centimeters tall, and like Bill, looked like someone used to hard work. His face was covered in deep wrinkles from years of labor. He behaved calmly and friendly. "Well, kid, hope you like it here," he said. "I don't mind helping," I replied. I was 28 and almost twice younger than Sam, so I thought I fit the definition of a kid. "I'll do my best," I said. At that moment, Colin called us to the table. Dinner was ready. Bill and his wife sat at the ends of the table, leaving Sam and me places in the center, opposite each other. On the table was a large dish of steaks, one plate of mashed potatoes, another with fresh green beans, and a tray of homemade rolls. "We're not picky about fancy food, Carson, but there's always enough to eat," said Colin with a smile. "Everything looks great," I sincerely replied. During dinner, I asked Bill if he had always lived here. "Yes," he replied. "My grandfather founded this place earlier and passed it down to my father. Now it belongs to me and Colin. When I was younger, I wasn't sure if she would become a part of it. Had to fend off a bunch of suitors to win her over," he said, giving his wife a mischievous look. Colin blushed slightly and responded, "Come on, Bill. You know you're the only man I've ever loved. My wife is responsible for the 3 happiest days of my life. The day she agreed to marry me, our wedding day, and the day she gave me our daughter, Caitlin. I didn't notice any signs of our daughter's presence, and Colin obviously caught my curious glance. Our daughter isn't home right now. She's getting her veterinary doctorate at the University of South Dakota. She only comes home for holidays, and we can't wait until she returns with her diploma," she explained. Bill added, "Good, having a veterinarian in the family helps cover some expenses." After dinner, I tried to help clear the table, but Colin insisted it was her duty and brushed me off. "Breakfast is at 5:30, and work starts at 6 a.m., Bill said. When we left the house, as Sam and I headed out, I noticed a fresh empty New York Times on the counter that Bill probably grabbed in town. I asked, "Can I borrow the front page?" He agreed. Outside, I asked Sam to come into my shed for a minute. Inside, I took out a digital camera and showed him how to use it. He took a close-up shot of the front page of the newspaper I was holding. I saw he was curious but didn't ask any unnecessary questions. However, he asked about the alarm clock, and I assured him I had one. "See you in the morning," he said and left. I uploaded the photo to my laptop and wrote an email to the police in my former city stating that I was alive and well and had left town voluntarily. Choosing a national newspaper over a local one helped keep my location secret. I sent the letter to Jake, asking him to visit a local coffee shop with free internet and forward the original letter with the photo to the police. I hoped this would help me avoid being listed as missing by national authorities or attract FBI attention. That night, I slept peacefully. The next morning, I woke up at 5 a.m., took a shower, and got dressed. After breakfast, I told Sam to drive me to replace the fence in the hilly part of the ranch to the barn where he pointed out a horse and saddle I would need. He seemed pleased with how I saddled a large brown mare. I already had some experience from my uncle's farm. Then we took 2 mules and secured them with bags carrying fence posts and barbed wire. Bill joined us, bringing a rifle in case we had to shoot a sick cow. "Just in case," he clarified, and the saddles on the horses were mounted. Sam and I headed along the stream into the hills. Along the way, we talked and got to know each other better. I shared my story and how I ended up in Montana, hoping he wouldn't betray my trust. In return, he told me about his life. He married right after high school, but one day caught his wife in bed with another man. In a rage, he almost killed the rival, for which he got 5 years in prison. After his release, Bill was the only one who gave him a job, and he spent 30 years on this ranch. Sam spoke highly of Bill and Colin, referring to them as people with capital letters. Half an hour later, we reached the fence marking the ranch boundaries. Sam indicated that not all posts needed replacement, only those that were rotten or close to it. About 1/3 required replacement. He stayed with me while I replaced the first 2 posts to ensure I was doing it right. Then he told me to work until 4 p.m. so I would have time to return to take care of the horses and mules and make it back in time for dinner. On the 4th day, I helped Sam start a few buildings. The next day, I returned to install fence posts. The following 2 months flew by unnoticed. Now, I regularly drove around the ranch. I was in the best physical shape of my life. We set up a weekend schedule. Sam rested on Saturdays, Bill on Sundays, and my day off fell on Mondays, when I did laundry and went to town if needed. I bonded with everyone quickly. Sam was a good-natured and calm person, and we often sat and talked. After dinner, I really respected Bill, an honest and hard-working man. We got along great. Colin was very kind to me and Sam, but there was a spark in her. Together with Bill, they made the perfect pair. Colin and Bill became more excited each day. During breakfast on Friday, Colin announced that their daughter would be returning home in a week. That day, it was my turn to check the fence and see if any cows had wandered into the forest. After 4 p.m., I headed to the stream. I was in a hurry, took off my shirt, and knelt by the water, dipping a bandana in the cool water to wash the dust off my face and neck. The neighing of a horse downstream caught my attention. I turned around and saw a rider approaching me. At first, I thought it was Colin, but I quickly realized it was her younger version, a beautiful woman who was definitely Caitlin. She had the same crystal blue eyes and red hair as her mother. She approached and stopped a few steps from me. When I stood up and turned to her, she asked coldly, "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" "My name is Carson, and I work here," I replied. "I don't believe it," she said. "My father said he couldn't afford to hire another worker." I was slightly irritated by her unfriendly demeanor, so I laughed on my way to the bank. On payday, she glanced at me, turned her horse around, and approached her car. I smirked to myself, put my hat back on, saddled the horse again, and headed to the barn. Later, I found out that there had been a misunderstanding between Caitlin and her parents. They thought she would return home only next week, but to their surprise, she arrived a couple of hours after I left town. She went around in circles, spent time with her parents, and then said she wanted to ride up. She saddled her horse and headed to her favorite spot. 2 months later, I became old news, and Bill and Colin simply forgot to mention me. When I returned to the barn, I noticed how the red-haired girl disappeared inside. I hurried and led the horse into the stall. It seemed Caitlin was looking for her father, and finally found him in the barn. I clearly heard her loud voice. "Who's that man by the stream?" Bill pondered for a moment and replied, "I think it was Carson." She added, "He said he works here?" "But the last time you said you couldn't afford to hire another worker," Bill shrugged. "Well, he wasn't lying. He really does work here. And as for his salary, it's none of your business. I still manage this ranch, young lady," she explained indignantly. "But Colin, you know that Carson is living here near Sam," Bill said, smiling slyly. "You remember how your father wanted to merge his ranch with yours? I thought it could be a good idea." Bill's face flushed with rage. "No way," he said. "Duck Ranch is twice the size of my ranch." I smiled. "You've been doing this all your life. I need your help. I want us to be equals. Colin, you'll handle the operational management, and your word will be law. Also, it's partially a ranch, so we'll keep everything in the family." He sat back down and looked at Colin. She nodded in agreement. Bill extended his hand across the table, and we shook hands firmly. "Damn, Carson, you're going to have to get used to this." I smirked. "That means we'll have more working hands to manage, and Sam will become the senior foreman. Now, I'll have to dig up all those posts I was struggling to install on this part of the land." Bill and I couldn't help but laugh loudly. Colin couldn't fully hide her smile either. That evening turned into a noisy and joyful celebration. Caitlin spent the night in my shed and, to put it mildly, wore me out. At breakfast the next morning, we noticed attentive glances from Bill and Colin. I was curious if they were guessing where their daughter had been. On the previous night after dinner, Caitlin had been talking with her parents and Sam, who had worked on the ranch before her birth. She didn't approach me directly, and I mostly remained silent. It was her return home, and I understood that her parents and Sam wanted to know how she had been all this time away from the ranch. As soon as I finished eating, I apologized and headed back to my shed to take a shower. I realized one thing. I have strong feelings for this amazing woman. If it weren't for my past, I wouldn't have married her. I went through different scenarios in my head, but ultimately, I realized that I couldn't have acted otherwise. I barely had time to get dressed before dinner when I walked into the kitchen. Bill, Colin, and Sam were already sitting at the table, but Caitlin was nowhere to be seen. When we took our seats, she entered and chose a chair next to me, not her usual spot next to Sam. Bill and Colin exchanged looks, and Caitlin warmly smiled in return. During dinner, she chatted animatedly despite her obvious curiosity. Her parents refrained from asking about the reason for her so good mood. After dinner, she helped her mother clean the kitchen while Sam and I went to our places. I felt perfectly fine with that. Bill returned in the afternoon, but waited until dinner to share the news. He explained that since it wasn't a high-category felony, Wilson and his accomplices would be released on bail. Although Bill didn't expect further problems, he warned us to stay alert. Then he looked at his daughter, laughed mischievously, and said, "If you plan to take another dip naked, you might want to bring Carson along for protection." Seeing her face covered in paint, she muttered something, jumped off her seat, and ran to her room. Bill and Sam burst into loud laughter, and even Colin couldn't hide her smile. I quietly laughed along with them. 3 days later, Bill received news that he could retrieve his vehicle. We loaded 3 horses into the trailer and headed to Wilson's ranch, accompanied by a police escort. Colin drove with us to then bring the trailer back. Once we unloaded the horses, Bill and Sam began herding the cattle back onto the ranch. Making sure all the livestock were in their place, we secured the fencing and headed back to the main house, satisfied with the work. Caitlin applied for her veterinary license. Usually, the approval process takes about 45 days. So, until then, she could only care for the animals on her father's ranch. I occasionally noticed her around the property, and during meal times, despite her silent attitude towards me. If I managed to catch her eye, I smiled broadly and playfully raised my eyebrows. It was always enough to make her blush. 2 weeks after the incident at the waterfall, we accidentally found ourselves in the barn alone. "Well, what are you doing here?" I asked. "Do you often swim lately?" she asked. I shrugged and replied, "I have a rule not to impose myself on women who aren't interested." I noticed her sharply turn her head and stare at me. I quickly lowered my hat with one hand and scratched the back of my neck with the other. "Why are you like this?" she said, grabbing my face with her right hand. I reacted quickly, grabbing her wrist before she could strike, without stopping her. She tried with her other hand, but I took both of her hands behind her back, pressing her body against mine. Slowly tilting my head towards her face, I looked her straight in the eyes. She looked at me, but didn't try to break free. "If you were mine, I'd slap you properly," I said, trying to distance myself. She responded, "You wouldn't dare suddenly." I released her and she lost her balance, falling to the floor of the barn. It wasn't that I wouldn't dare. I had already gotten rid of one woman I didn't care about and wasn't going to waste time on another. Usually, she'd be the first to leave the room, but this time I turned around and left, leaving her sitting on the floor. We didn't cross paths until dinner, as expected. She didn't say a word, but the look she gave me was strange. Although I don't understand women and my marriage to Janice proved it, the next day I worked in the barn. When I walked in, Bill, knowing he didn't have Sundays off, guessed he came to talk. I wondered if Caitlin had told him about the incident, and if he was asking me to leave. I stopped and turned to him. "You and Caitlin had a little duel yesterday," he said. "Well, Colin told her father, but I noticed a sly glint in his eyes," I replied. "Yes, I think she's trying to figure out what to think about you. At first, she decided you're here for some gain, then you became the hero who saved her and helped protect the ranch. Now she can't understand why you're not chasing after her like the local guys, like her mother did in her youth. Caitlin is used to guys circling her. She had a few boyfriends, but none stayed long. I hope you won't let her drive you away like her mother did." He nodded approvingly. "Thank you, Carson. It means a lot to me." As for Caitlin, I decided to stop teasing her and hoped we could just coexist peacefully. He left the barn, and I returned to my work. I had a whole day to think about Bill's words. If Caitlin truly wanted to understand me, behaving politely and just talking would have been much more effective than her current approach. As for chasing after her like other guys, that definitely wasn't going to happen. That evening during dinner, she wasn't there. No one brought up the topic, and I didn't ask either. The next day, I stuck to my usual routine and got up at 5 a.m. Despite it being a day off, after breakfast, when Sam and Bill went out on errands, I did laundry. Bill set up a large washing and drying machine, allowing me to wash all my clothes in one load. The laundromat was next to the kitchen, so while my clothes were washing, I sat at the kitchen table, ate, and talked with Colin. At that moment, Caitlin entered the kitchen, a rare occurrence in the early morning as she usually preferred to eat later. Colin asked about my plans for the day, and I said I was thinking of having lunch in town, then asked if she needed anything. She replied that she had a couple of small things to buy that would be nice to have. I assured her that it wouldn't be difficult for me. At that moment, Caitlin intervened. "Cool, I'm going to go with you. I was just about to stop by the store to pick up a few things, and it would be silly if we drove in two cars." I looked up, surprised, and replied, "Of course, I'd be happy to take you along after yesterday." I didn't expect her to even talk to me, let alone go on a trip to town together. I drove away about an hour later when I finished doing laundry. I entered the barn to settle my things and started saddling the horse. After driving some time, I found myself at the top of the waterfall. The weather was beautiful. I tied the horse to a tree and sat on the edge of the cliff, looking down at the calm water below. I sat there for half an hour, maybe longer. When I saw Caitlin approaching in the water below, I stepped out and noticed her face painted. She cautiously approached me, trying to avoid any accusations of eavesdropping in case she was planning to swim naked again. I picked up a stone and threw it into the water, causing a splash. She tensed up, looking for the source of the noise, and saw me. I expected her to turn around and leave, but to my surprise, she jumped back on her horse and headed towards me. She tied her horse next to mine. I stood up and moved a few steps away from the edge of the waterfall, in case she tried to push me down. "You expletive," she said, stopping a few centimeters from me. "And you're still expletive," I replied. This time, I didn't wait for her slap. I grabbed her waist and kissed her, then released her. I quickly turned around to leave, but she grabbed my arm and turned back towards me. To my astonishment, she reached out, wrapped her arms around my neck, and kissed me again passionately. As the passion grew, our clothes disappeared, and we spent unforgettable time together. Afterwards, we saddled the horses and headed back. After we led the horses into the stall, Caitlin silently turned around and went to her room. Colin noticed and gave me an accusing look. I intervened. "First of all, Caitlin, I wasn't spying on you. I was following the horse trails to the stream. Secondly, think about what could have happened if I wasn't there. I doubt those three were planning a picnic." Seeing you swimming naked, Colin added, "Thank God you ended up there, Carson. It's scary to think what could have happened." After that, we changed the topic and quickly finished dinner, knowing we had to get up early the next day. Caitlin wasn't there, and no one brought up the incident. I didn't ask either. The next day, I followed my usual routine and got up at 5 a.m. Even though it was a day off, after breakfast, when Sam and Bill went out on errands, I did laundry. Bill set up a large washing and drying machine, allowing me to wash all my clothes in one load. The laundromat was next to the kitchen, so while my clothes were washing, I sat at the kitchen table, ate, and talked with Colin. At that moment, Caitlin entered the kitchen, a rare occurrence in the early morning as she usually preferred to eat later. Colin asked about my plans for the day, and I said I was thinking of having lunch in town, then asked if she needed anything. She replied that she had a couple of small things to buy that would be nice to have. I assured her that it wouldn't be difficult for me. At that moment, Caitlin intervened. "Cool, I'm going to go with you. I was just about to stop by the store to pick up a few things, and it would be silly if we drove in two cars." I looked up, surprised, and replied, "Of course, I'd be happy to take you along after yesterday." I didn't expect her to even talk to me, let alone go on a trip to town together. I drove away about an hour later when I finished doing laundry. I entered the barn to settle my things and started saddling the horse. After driving some time, I found myself at the top of the waterfall. The weather was beautiful. I tied the horse to a tree and sat on the edge of the cliff, looking down at the calm water below. I sat there for half an hour, maybe longer. When I saw Caitlin approaching in the water below, I stepped out and noticed her face painted. She cautiously approached me, trying to avoid any accusations of eavesdropping in case she was planning to swim naked again. I picked up a stone and threw it into the water, causing a splash. She tensed up, looking for the source of the noise, and saw me. I expected her to turn around and leave, but to my surprise, she jumped back on her horse and headed towards me. She tied her horse next to mine. I stood up and moved a few steps away from the edge of the waterfall in case she tried to push me down. "You expletive," she said, stopping a few centimeters from me. "And you're still expletive," I replied. This time, I didn't wait for her slap. I grabbed her waist and kissed her, then released her. I quickly turned around to leave, but she grabbed my arm and turned back towards me. To my astonishment, she reached out, wrapped her arms around my neck, and kissed me again passionately. As the passion grew, our clothes disappeared, and we spent unforgettable time together. Afterwards, we saddled the horses and headed back. After we led the horses into the stall, Caitlin silently turned around and went to her room. Colin noticed and gave me an accusing look. I intervened. "First of all, Caitlin, I wasn't spying on you. I was following the horse trails to the stream. Secondly, think about what could have happened if I wasn't there. I doubt those three were planning a picnic." Having spent the summer establishing the ranch and building relationships with the Backman family, my life had taken a new and unexpected turn. Caitlin and I continued to develop our relationship, balancing our work on the ranch with our growing personal connection. Despite the challenges and the shadows of my past, I found solace and purpose in this new chapter of my life. Over the next few months, our bond strengthened. Caitlin's veterinary practice flourished, and the ranch thrived under our joint management. We built a strong, supportive family environment, leaving behind the turmoil and betrayal that had marked my previous life. As time went on, I realized that sometimes escaping from the past can lead to a future filled with genuine love and fulfillment. In general, write your opinion about this story. You can also share yours in the comments. It will be interesting to read. Don't forget to subscribe and like. Your support is very important to me. Take care of yourself.